As a growing number of public sector unions contemplate industrial action to secure pay rises for their members, lobby group the Taxpayers Union has released a report that claims those workers are already receiving too much more than their private sector counterparts. Well, joining us from Wellington to explain how they reached that conclusion is the Taxpayers Union's Louis Houlbrooke. Louis, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Just talk me through this report.
Well, we've looked at the public sector wage gap. This is the premium that you get if you're working for the public sector as opposed to if you're working in the private sector. We've found that if you're working for the government, you essentially earn, on average, about a third more than a private sector worker. But crucially, this gap has actually almost doubled since the early 90s. Now, this is despite what the unions would tell us about cutbacks in the public service. Now, our concern is that this gap is actually morally questionable because the people who pay these salaries are the private sector taxpayers who on average earn far less. With the current round of industrial action, now there's a concern that this gap could actually get even wider. So that's why we're releasing this report today.
So what exactly are you saying? Are you suggesting that public servants get paid more because they're paid by the government and they're on a track to go into some kind of government position?
Well, that's part of... I think the main reason is probably very effective lobbying from groups like the Public Service Association. The public sector unions always have been quite influential. And we see now, especially when you have a government such as Labour, which is seen as a soft target for these types of strikes, it's very easy to use political pressure to ratchet up the pay regardless of need. So we see our role as to push back against this constant ratcheting up of pay and actually shedding light on the taxpayers who earn a little bit less, but yet still have to pay for these constant hikes. Let's
talk about the report itself. You compared the public service with the private sector, but you're not comparing apples with apples there, are you? I mean, you're comparing two vastly different jobs in a lot of situations.
It's true that there are different groups of people, and that could explain why there is a gap in the pay level. What it doesn't explain is why that gap has nearly doubled in the space of 25 years. We think that's better explained by political action from groups such as the Public Service Association, using pressure on Labour governments which are seen as soft targets to keep...
Louis, could it come down to something like the cost of education? You know, people who were being trained in the 80s weren't facing the kind of cost that the people who've been training since are facing. And a lot of people who are in the public service, your nurses, your teachers, for example, have education costs involved in their professions.
Well, people in nursing and in teaching, they have what we call a legitimate case for some of these higher pay rates, not so much because of education, but simply because of the staffing issues involved. They need more funds to attract more talent. However, our concern is with government departments such as MB and the IRD, who are currently considering strike action. Now, they don't have the same issue in attracting staff. Sure, they're highly educated, but there's no shortage of graduates coming out of Wellington queuing up for these pretty cushy jobs.
I'm glad you clarified that a little bit, Louis, because I was worried you were going to have nurses and teachers throughout the country throwing things at the TV. What is your take on the current industrial action then from some of those groups, from the nurses, for example, from the teachers?
Well, it's interesting. We've seen a series of claims starting with nurses and teachers, which seem to be based around legitimate issues of staffing. What we've then seen is the Public Service Association piggybacking off of these more legitimate campaigns to claim higher wages for the likes of policy advisors and cultural advisors and case managers at the MB and the IRD. Now, we think that's a little bit deceptive, and that's why we're trying to clarify these issues. OK,
so you would say that what we're seeing with the nurses, for example, at the moment is fair, and that perhaps nurses have a valid case for wanting more money?
I think we can disagree on the exact extent to which wages should be hiked. That's up for negotiation. However, the general principle that some government departments will require higher pay, now that's sound. What we've looked at is the average, and we suspect it's actually people earning far above the average that are bringing this up. So we think the government needs to think about potentially even freezing wages in some of those higher paid departments.
Louis, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Louis Houlbrooke there from the Taxpayers Union. When he's talking about freezing wages, I think, you know, there's going to be a little bit of... But if he's talking about some of those higher paid positions, then, you know, there's going to be some people out there who don't disagree with that.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people who will look at especially the top positions and say, for goodness sake, do we need to be paying some of our public servants $500,000 a year or more in some cases? Couple of points, though. Are we really comparing people who might have a couple of university degrees with people who might not have any tertiary education and are working like in a forecourt in a petrol station?
Private sector is very broad, isn't it?
This is the thing. Like, it seems to me like you're comparing completely different things. And also, since 1990 is the comparison. So we're looking at an increase of 35, or almost 35%, is the current difference compared to 20% in 1990. 1990 was the year that we started paying for tertiary education in New Zealand. So if you are graduating with $50 or $60 or $100,000 worth of debt, shouldn't you expect to be earning more? Anyway, we will put some of those points to Glenn Barclay from the PSA this morning. Good morning, Glenn. What do you make of this survey?
Oh, look, it's complete nonsense, Jack's absolute nonsense. As you pointed out in your questioning, they're dealing with averages in the public service. They're not dealing with the actual mix of the workforce. The workforces are quite different. The public service has far fewer casual and temporary staff, part-time staff than the private sector. They have far higher proportions of workers who do have qualifications and training. And so, you know, the workforce is quite different. And over time, the mix in that workforce has changed. We've seen a growth in IT and other data and information-driven occupations, and a decrease as a proportion of clerical and admin workers. So, you know, it's like comparing apples and oranges, and so that just doesn't cut it.
Well, to be fair to the Taxpayers Union, they say that we can expect some sort of a discrepancy, that people in the public service and people in the private sector shouldn't necessarily be paid exactly the same. However, their concern is with the rate of change. So in 1990, the gap used to be 20% between the private sector and the public service. Now it's 34.6% by the same measure. So what do you put that change down to?
Well, as I said, it's the changing nature of the workforce. There's been a growth of IT and similar roles, information data type roles, a decrease in the proportion of clerical and admin roles. But also, you know, if you cast your mind back to those early days, there was a lot of restructuring going on in the public sector, in which we saw government departments contract out a lot of jobs that were previously directly employed, and those include cleaning, catering, and those kind of positions, which tend to be lower paid.
What about education? The cost of education. Well, no, has the cost of education had any impact? Because it was 1990 when we started paying for tertiary education.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of there are a lot of actually still low-paid workers within the public service, and many of those still are carrying student loans. And that's the major problem. I mean, we saw, for example, when the government announced last week that the living wage would be paid out to workers in the core public service. There are about 2,000 workers who that was affected, who were directly affected by that. And of those, we know that a number of them are carrying student loans because they still required degrees to get the work that they were doing.
Down the end of the report, there are some interesting numbers I wanted to throw at you. So the Taxpayers Union says people in the public sector take on average 8.6 sick days a year. People in the private sector take 5. What do you put that down to?
Oh, well, once again, we're dealing in averages here, and without looking at the underlying reasons. You know, if you're in the private sector, many small employers rely on the statutory minimum when it comes to sick leave, which is 5 days a year. You know, and the agreements we've negotiated, not surprisingly, we've managed to negotiate something a bit better than that, so that people have proper protection when they're off. And of course, you know, if you're on 5 days a year, then you're either going to take days without pay, not counting as sick leave, or else you're going to come into work when you shouldn't really be there because you're sick. So you'll spread your germs around the workplace, or else you might be, you know, cause other problems as a consequence of that. And, you know, the bulk of our members are frontline workers dealing in really stressful jobs, have lots of public contact, are going to be exposed to various illness and stress. And so this is perfectly understandable.
OK, thank you for your time this morning, Glenn. That's Glenn Barclay from the PSA.
8.6 sick days a year does seem quite high, doesn't it?
It does seem high.
It seems quite high.
It does seem high. I would have said 5 sick days is a lot.
How many sick days would you take a year?
Well, 0.
Maddie?
Next to none.
Although you've got the flu.
I am sick at the moment, but I'm here.
Yeah, great.
Well, that's not necessarily a good thing either, though, is it?
I'm sorry.
But I think that seems quite high to me. I don't know. What would be a normal amount of sick days a year?
Maybe 3? 3 or 4?
Yeah, I'd pick about 3 or 4.
I think it depends on how many kids you have, doesn't it? Well, if you're taking sick days because your kid's sick.
Well, yes, well, that's true.
You know
that's
what I mean?
true. Yeah. Alrighty. Well, just something to think about.
Oh, it's just worth
Stay healthy. Stay healthy, lads.
I'm working on it.
All right.